How's it going, ladies and gentlemen? Hello and welcome back to Heartland Junction. Today we're going to be taking a brief look at how I wired my N-scale model railroad, the 2x4 that we looked at in the last video. I had a commenter ask about it, and so I'm by no means an expert in this field, but I just want to tell you a little about what I know and what I did. So the first thing we should cover, if you're new to the subject, new to model railroading, maybe you just have heard the terms but don't actually know what they mean, we discuss what DC is and what DCC is and the difference. So first up is DC. DC is the most common, oldest means of controlling your model trains. It stands for direct current. And the way that DC works is you have your controller that is plugged into your layout. The track has no power to it. You turn up the dial, it increases the amount of electricity going into the track, which then connects to the train's motor and the lights and makes it go faster and the lights get brighter, and that's how that goes. It's very simple. The problem with DC, you can't control multiple trains on it at one time unless different sections of track are separately electrically wired and you have a different controller for each one, which is where DCC comes in. Now, DCC stands for Digital Command Control. So the way that this works is the DCC controller sends out a constant amount of electricity to the rails, and then the controller uses specific signals that are connected to the DCC chips, computer chips basically, that are inside the locomotive, and that tells the locomotive whether it's supposed to go or not depending on the signal. And then it allows it to pick up the amount of current that it needs to move whatever speed step you've got selected. So you can control multiple trains at a time going in different directions, going in the same direction, different speeds, doesn't matter. So what are the advantages and disadvantages to DC versus DCC? Well, DC generally works well for smaller layouts. Maybe you only have a single track running around and you have an isolated yard. It also tends to be quite a bit cheaper because DCC decoder chips that you put inside of your locomotives tend to run, the price varies. If you have ones without sound, it can add an extra 20, 30 bucks maybe to the cost of your train. Or if you have the sound chips, they can get up to even $100 more. So if you've got a small layout and you don't care about the fancy stuff running multiple trains or sound, DC might be the better way to go because you're going to save a lot more money over time if you're picking up a lot of equipment. Now, if you're someone like me who prefers, the realism of being able to operate multiple things on the same track at the same time, running in different directions, DCC, while it is more expensive, is going to be a lot more realistic and it's going to run a lot better, typically. Okay, now that we've covered the basics here on DC versus DCC, obviously I chose DCC for my N-scale layout and also my HO scale layout, but we're just taking a look at the 2x4 N-scale layout today. Let's head on over there. I'll show you the wiring that I did, what that looks like, and go from there. So when it comes to wiring your layout, there's going to be some differences depending on the system that you're using. Now, if you're using something simple like the Bachmann Easy Command system, you'll have a piece of power track like this, kind of similar to the Kato, how on the Kato the wires go into the bottom of the track. On the Bachmann system, it plugs into the side here, and then you have your wire that runs into the Easy Command system, or the system that I use, which I've mentioned before, is NCE. It's probably similar to Digitrax. I don't actually know exactly if there's any variance with how Digitrax is wired because I've never used it, but those are a couple of the big main companies. You'll have a little connector piece with NCE at least here that plugs into the back of the we call the panel here, and so that'll connect there. That's where you connect your bus wires that are going to connect into the main part of the layout. In this case with the Kato, it's just this wire that comes with the power track. But in the case of this layout that I built, you have the panel here, and then on the inside of it, you have these wires. Now, typically when you're wiring for DCC, depending on how big your layout is, you can either have wires, just one set of wires that run directly to the track, or in this case, which I probably didn't need to have one for the size of this layout, but I decided to run a bus. Basically what a bus is, you have the wires that come directly from your control panel here, run all the way around the inside, following your main basic run. And then connected to each of those, you have wires that come down through the board that connect to your track and then are connected electrically to the bus wires. So you have the outside rail and the inside rail, which you typically want to use different colored wiring for so you don't accidentally mix it up and then end up with shorts or something like that. Then what I chose to do here specifically to connect them, because I didn't want to fiddle with cutting the wires and soldering everything together, I got some of these clips. I forget exactly what they're called. Let me grab the packaging here. What I always heard them referred to is briefcase clips, because they kind of look like a little briefcase. Here's the packaging for it. They're self-stripping electrical tap connectors. I'm going to pull one out of the box here for you so you can see what it looks like when it's not connected to the wire. And this is a trick that I found on a YouTube video many years ago when I was designing or planning for my original layout. So you have the full clip here. If you look inside, if that'll focus, you have one section that runs completely through, and then you have one section that's insulated on one end and open on the other end. So you put your feeder wire in on the insulated end, and then your bus wire would go over in the open section. You grab your pair of pliers, clamp down the splice, I think that's what it's called, which will connect the two wires electrically, and then you fold the clip over to lock it into place. And it should snap into place and stay solid. It won't come undone. It's not supposed to anyway. And yeah, that's how you connect up your track. And then obviously on the front side of the layout, you can see we have our feeder wires there, which you're going to solder to the edges of the track. Mine are a little bit hard to see because I did paint over them and ballast over them and cover up with scenery, but you can see a little bit there where it was soldered to the rail. Again, keeping the outside rail and the inside rail for every spot consistent so you don't end up with any electrical shorts. And one other thing that I forgot to mention was the type of wire that I used. So I used some 14 gauge wire for the bus. Now there is some debate that I've seen because I did a fair bit of research on this subject before I was making this video about what size wire you should use for a bus. Some people said 16 gauge, some people said 12 gauge. 14 obviously is right in the middle of that. Again, the gauge of the wire, the larger the wire is more beneficial the larger the layout, from what I've read up. Correct me if I'm wrong, because like I said, I'm not an electrician, I'm not an expert on the subject, so take that with a grain of salt. Maybe do a little bit more research for yourself, but it seems like somewhere 12, 14, 16 gauge wire, depending on the size of your layout. And then for the track feeders, you need a thinner gauge of wire typically, because trying to connect a wire of this thickness up to your tiny rail, that's not going to come through. That's very blurry. It's very difficult to see on the camera. You typically want something thinner, and for that I used this 20 gauge wire that was designed for things like a doorbell. And I think that's going to just about do it for today, guys. That was a brief look at the difference between what DC and DCC is and what I did wiring my N-scale 2x4 train layout. If you want to know more about the subject, I suggest you go online, do some more research for yourself. Like I said, I'm by no means an expert. I believe that everything I said here is perfectly accurate, but do some research for yourself before you get going on your own project or upgrading your layout if you're going from DC to DCC. I will include a link down in the description of this video to an NCE guide that I found on converting from DC to DCC. Again, a lot of this is going to cover what we talked about in this video, but it might be a good thing to just browse over if you're thinking about converting from DC to DCC yourself. So that's going to conclude our video today, guys. I hope this was helpful in some way to you. If not, thanks for visiting anyway and hanging out with me for about 10 minutes. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and we'll catch you in the next video.